Hello, everyone. This is Jeffery Giesener for the Obligation of Memory interview series. I am also the founder of the Jewish Culture and Holocaust Remembrance Group. And I'm honored to have Abe Mizliach with me from Fremont, California, who's going to share his background. He was born just after the war ended, and he has a really great story. So I'm going to turn it over to you, and I'm going to ask you to start, Abe, by telling us a little bit about your family, your parents, where they were born, any kind of stories that you have that you know from them, and I'll keep going. We'll take it from there. So go ahead.
Well, thank you, Jeffrey, and thank you for giving me the honor to speak today, and I'm really excited about it. And I want to thank you for all the great work you've been doing and all the interviews you've been doing. It's a really special thing that you're doing, and I'm really happy that
I appreciate that. Thank you, Abe.
Well, let's start with my parents. My father, Leon, he was born in Thessaloniki, Greece, or otherwise said Salonika, in 1912. His parents, Palomba and Abraham, they were in the poultry business. They spoke Turkish and Ladino at home. Ladino is a Sephardic language that is a combination of Spanish and Hebrew. And as you know, these folks were, there was an expulsion in 1492 of Jews from Spain and Portugal, and they went to all over Europe and the Middle East, including my father. My grandfather's family lived in Greece for many, many years. And my grandfather's family came from Istanbul, Turkey. So that's why there was both Ladino and Turkish going on at home. My father had two brothers, Lazer and Hayam, and two sisters, Sarah and Rosa. They went to a private school, a French private school in Saloniki. And when the war started, Leon became a soldier for the Greek army as a bayonet handler and bugler. One thing I kind of remember is that he, for some reason, was able to keep his bugle when he was taken by the Nazis. So that's pretty amazing. My mother, Lola, was born in Szysłowicz, Poland in 1920. Her parents, Hannah and Lebush, were tailors, and she had two brothers, Velvu and Yanko, and a sister, Helen. They lived in the Polish, so Szysłowicz is an eastern part of Poland, and their generations have gone back quite a long time in Poland. So I think that's an overview. Have any other questions about that?
Yep. Okay. So we have your father seems to be about 8 years younger than your mother.
Father older than my mother.
Older, yes, older than your mother. My father was also 1921 was when he was born in Stuttgart, Germany. So tell us a little bit about their road into 1939 when the war broke out.
So on my father's side, as you may know, the Nazis came late into Greece in 1942. And you've probably seen pictures where the rabbi in Saloniki brought everybody together in the big plaza for the Germans to meet them. And unfortunately, 98% of the Jews of Salonika ended up going to Auschwitz and dying. On my mother's side, she decided to volunteer when the Nazis came into her town. She thought that she could save her parents or family by volunteering and working in a munitions camp nearby. But unfortunately, that didn't work out. She never saw her family again. They all perished.
So your parents, your father, he was trailed. So what happened to him in Greece? Did he eventually wind up going to a concentration camp, or he went?
Yes.
Okay.
So I'm sorry. So him and his brother Chaim ended up going into in a camp, a work camp in Lamia, Greece, to build a tunnel for a railroad. And then in 1943, they were both sent to Auschwitz. Okay.
When do you know when?
1943. I don't know what month or date.
Okay. And what about your mother's side?
My mother ended up staying in the munitions camp for a long time, for several years, and ended up going to Bergen-Belsen.
Do you know which munitions factory? Was it Hesches Lichtenau?
Yeah, well, let's see. Hold on. It was the one that's a lot of people say that their parents were at. Give me a second.
That's okay. We'll just know. So it's interesting. I asked you the date of when your father and brother and his brother went, because my parents, my mother's side, all were deported from Czechoslovakia, Košice, Czechoslovakia, in May of 1943. And if your father and brother were in there at that time, you probably know he probably could have met my grandfather, who was in the men's lager in May of 1943. This is how all this, all these data points kind of like connect into each other. I also have a very good friend whose mother was also in Bergen-Belsen. So it's very possible that your mother could have been in Bergen-Belsen with Saul Pincheski, who's a great friend of mine. And he also wrote a book, From Bergen-Belsen to Brooklyn. So all of, again, these pieces all come together. So without getting into, I tend to, for the audience's sake, I tend to not want to take us into the horrors of the camp experience. So I'm going to ask you recollections. I know you were born shortly after the war, and I don't know how much. So let's ask this obvious question. Did your parents talk to you about the Holocaust?
No.
Not one, not at all, which is very
no. They did when I interviewed them.
Okay. And when was that?
That's when I was in college.
Okay.
So it took a long time. So the story behind that is that a friend of mine showed me a book called The Children of Holocaust Survivor by Epstein, Helen Epstein, right? Everybody probably that is a second generation has read that book. And that kind of opened my eyes in the fact that I was not the only one that was dealing with all of these emotions and dealing with parents that were closed up, and that I know they suffered a lot, but they wouldn't feel comfortable talking about it. So at that time, I decided during the time when maybe a summer when I came back from college, I decided to videotape my mom and dad and get
Well,
their whole story.
I'm really pleased that you did that, because from my side, my parents were absolutely refusing to speak about anything that was related to the Shoah, both my father and my mother, even to my father's brother, who asked my mother about her Auschwitz experience, and she refused to discuss it even with my father's brother, which is, just to show you that it wasn't just related to children. So let me ask you a couple more questions going back before we, so how did your parents, obviously your parents were liberated from Auschwitz and Bergen-Belsen, and when was that? Do you know?
Could I go back a little bit and talk
Sure,
about
sure.
some of the
Anywhere,
things
anywhere
that,
you, anywhere you want to go.
because of course, I'll never forget uh, the luck and the bravery and strength of my father and mother. And that's why I'm here, my brother's here, my sister's here, and the families grew from there. Is that the first thing was when he was in Auschwitz with his brother, he was in line with possibly Mengele. And Mengele said left, right, left, right. Well, Leon was older than Chaim. And Chaim was in front of Leon in the line. And the doctor pointed to the left, which means stay in the camp and work, and pointed to the right for Leon, my father. My father knew a little bit of German, and he said, and he pointed to Chaim, he said, my Bruder, my Bruder. And for some reason, the German guy let him go. He said, go with your brother. So he saved himself one time. And throughout his experience in the camps, he got lucky. Both of them got lucky that when the Warsaw Uprising happened, they shipped 500 Greek Jews from Auschwitz to Warsaw. First of all, they didn't want the Polish people to talk to each other, so the Greeks were there. They didn't understand Polish, and so that was one reason. They also knew the Greeks had a history of being very strong physical workers, and they needed that kind of work in Warsaw. Well, that saved them again, because if they stayed in Auschwitz, that the chances for them to survive wouldn't happen. And then, of course, he was marched to Germany when the Russians started coming into Poland and Warsaw, and he survived a 3-day march as well. And the final part is that he was put on a train to, right when the Germans knew that the Americans were nearby and that they're going to lose the war, they continued to want to kill the Jews they had. And they put my father and a bunch of other people, and I think this is historically written down, on a train. But the conductors of the train and the German soldiers who were not Nazis felt that, the war is over. Why should we be killing more people? And that they would be treated better if they surrendered by the Americans. And so the train went up and back, up and back, up and back until the Americans arrived and the doors opened. And my father couldn't believe his eyes that there were Americans there. He was sure that he was going to die. And the final story about that is that when an American captain saw my father there, he couldn't believe all these people were so skinny and looked like skeletons. And he told my father, don't think about the past. You're alive, you're free now. Think about the future, start a family, and grow from there. And I think that was on his mind when he was in his camp. And so
can I ask you, what you're talking about your father? What happened to his brother? Was he
unfortunately, his brother was not maybe as smart. He felt that he could sit in the infirmary and maybe he was sick, but he wanted to be in an infirmary, and he thought he could survive that way. And my father kept telling him, that's not a good idea. You're not going to survive being in that infirmary. And then one day he never saw him again.
I see. So let's take a little bit of path and talk about your mother, what you, her Miriam Belson story, if you know anything about it.
One thing about talking to my parents, and you probably have heard this hundreds of times with other people, is that maybe one person's willing to talk, the other person isn't. My father really was great at telling stories about his experience, and my mother didn't say very much at all. I think she had a very difficult experience, and she was traumatized quite a lot from her experience. So
Now, did she lose her whole family, or is she
yeah,
the only survivor?
she was the only survivor of her family, and my father was the only survivor of his family.
Okay, so let's take this away from the camps, and let's say, okay, the war is now 1945. There is liberation, and your father is in Warsaw, right?
Well, he went on a march
Okay.
to Germany,
Oh, okay.
and he ended up in Buchenwald.
Okay.
And that was also near Dachau. So I
Yeah.
think a lot of people ended up in Dachau, right, in 1945. So at that time, both both of them went down to Dachau, and they were liberated there, and they were both taken to a displaced persons camp.
So both your parents, did they know each other in Dachau, or
No.
did they? So let's talk about some positives. How did your parents meet each other? Where did they meet? And let's start there, and let's start tracing the next successful chapters of their lives. So let's talk about the DP camp, because I know for a fact, I believe you were born in that DP camp. So
Right.
you have some obviously tangent interest in that whole story. So go ahead.
Well, thank you. Yes, so they both went to Feldafing, Germany, and that was the largest Jewish DP camp in Germany. Feldafing used to be a Hitler Youth summer camp, and then it was turned into a DP camp after the war. It's about 20 miles southwest of Munich. My father was in the cafeteria. Here's the story I was told. Was in the cafeteria serving food, and my mother came in, and she asked him if she could have an extra potato. And he said something like, I'll give you an extra potato if you go into the back room with me. And she said, no way, I'm not going in the back room with you, only if you marry me. And as you know, many of these people that went to DP camps married right away and had children right away. And that's what happened. They got married, and I was born in May of 1946.
So that's the story on how they met. That's an
That's right.
amazing.
That's the story that
That's an amazing
he
story.
told me.
Did she go
And
eventually get to the back room?
that's not in the story. I don't know that. That was maybe the X-rated part of it. But the important thing, I think, is that my father remembered what the captain, American captain, told him, is forget about all the horrible things that you experienced and start a new life, get married, have kids.
Okay. And so when were you born?
In May of 1946.
Okay. And at that camp. And so now let's discuss the journey. So your parents are in this DP camp. Where are their passions to go to? Do they always wanted to come to the United States? Did they want to go to another country? Israel, from Israel to the United States? Maybe you can tell us the trail of their immigration eventually. And eventually they came to the United States, right?
Yes,
Yeah.
right.
Okay.
So as you may know, the history is that Feldafing was a large camp, and there was a lot of movement and marches and all sorts of activities to for them to be taken to Israel. They were what nationless people. There's a term for that.
Mhm,
They couldn't go back to Poland or Greece,
mhm.
and so they wanted to go to Israel. And my father told me that when I was a baby, they were given an opportunity to go to Israel, and they carried me uh, through Italy. I mean, from Germany through Italy, Austria, Italy, and I think they ended up in Italy. But for some reason, they couldn't get on a boat to Israel.
And what year was this roughly, guessing?
It was probably 1947. I was probably a year or less old.
So let
I
me
was a
tell
baby.
you, so let me tell you a little bit of what I know. So
Okay.
my mother was survived Auschwitz with her three older sisters. They were together and kept themselves alive. Um, and they, as your brother was pointed by Mengele, so was my aunt or their youngest sister, Magda, who she was only age 8. She was told to go to the right. Her mother wouldn't let her hand go, and
Wow.
they were both gassed on the first day of
Oh
arrival
no.
at
Oh,
the camp. So what's really interesting also is what you just said. In 1947, my mother didn't want to stay in Košice any longer, so she boarded a ship with 2,000 other immigrants to go to Israel.
wow.
In 1947, I have the name of the ship, I can't recall it at the moment. They were blockaded going into Britain, going into Palestine by the British.
Right. Right.
And then she was turned back on the ship and she spent another year in Cyprus. And
This
it's
was
very,
not the Exodus.
no, it
This
wasn't,
a
it
different
was,
ship.
it was not. It was a
Okay.
different ship. It was started with an H. But what's interesting is that ability for you in 1947 with your parents to try to go to Palestine was probably impossible because there was only 10,000 immigrants, which is my research, that British were allowing to go into Palestine. So you couldn't probably get a visa, and that's probably why you were unable to make that trip in 1947. My mother actually, after the war, which my father was escaped Nazi Berlin in 1935 and 36 at age 15, and he went to Israel on the last Hadassah Aliyot kinder transport, and he grew up on a kibbutz Yagur in Israel, and he fought in the War of Independence in the Air Force.
That's
After that,
great.
after that war, my mom was able to get on a boat that actually went to Tel Aviv as Israel, not as Palestine. So she arrived in 1948, shortly after the war, and that's how she got to Palestine. So I think all these dates, and what's fascinating to me and why I love doing what I'm doing with you and others, is that I don't have a story from my parents, but through you and others, I get the stories, and all of my dates start to line up, and we can share those. And perhaps you didn't know what I just told you about Palestine and the mandate,
Right. Right.
that these connections, these connective tissues that we all feel to each other are so important, and that's why I love doing these interviews. But go ahead.
Well,
You were saying that they couldn't get to Israel. So what happened next?
so Jeffrey, that is brilliant. That is really brilliant what you said in terms of you are recreating your history through us.
Mhm.
Fantastic. Thank you. So they couldn't get to Israel. I got sick with scarlet fever, and they, of course, uh, couldn't go anywhere. And they were worried that I was going to die. And fortunately, I did get better, but that took a while.
And how old were you? Do you know?
Geez, probably 2, 3 years old, something
Mhm.
like that.
Mhm.
And then when I was 4 years old, uh, my mother was pregnant with my brother, David. And of course, they wouldn't allow her to travel on a boat while she was pregnant. I've
Mhm.
heard other stories where they were able to do this. So we waited. And then another problem was that as Leon being Greek, American felt that they were worried about the Greeks being communists, and they really limited the number of Greeks that they allowed in the United States. And of course, this was in 1948, Israel became a state, but I think at that time, they were more interested in going to the United States. They knew nobody there, but it seems like the history was that things are starting to open up after 48, which allowed people to go to maybe different parts of the world. So in 1950, we ended up getting on a boat and heading to New York City. It was my brother, myself, my mom and dad. And I actually do remember being on the boat because we all got sick, of course. And I was just so scared. I didn't understand why I couldn't see land for days on end. Just water all around, no land, and that scared me.
Will you go on a boat now?
Oh yeah, I'll go on the boat. But,
So your brother is how many years younger than you are?
he's 4 years younger.
Okay, so you get to New York. So what's the story of how your parents made a life in New York? Where did they live? Where did they work? What did they work at? And then where did you go to school, both you and your brother? And then I guess your sister was born in New York as well. Then,
No, she was born much, much later.
I see. Okay.
So we arrived in New York, and for some reason, I mean, I remember some experiences of being in Feldafing, but I don't remember what happened in New York. Maybe it was pretty crazy and traumatic because everything was changing for them as well as for me and my brother. So that's kind of blank. But I know that the Jewish Federation helped them. And my father was given a job in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. So we moved to Camden, New Jersey, across the river. And
my parents came from Israel. They were sponsored in 1954. They came to Allentown, Pennsylvania.
And how far away is that from Philadelphia?
An hour.
Okay. So there was on Kane Avenue, and I can't believe that I remember the street in Camden, New Jersey, was a lot of people. They used to call us the Greeners, right? We were the Greeners. A lot of survivors and people that just came over were in that area. And so my father got a job in a clothing factory. And of course, that's common for many Jews to be able to work in the clothing industry. And he was a spreader of spreading the material out. We stayed in Camden for about 5 years. And one of the people that he worked with, and there was also a survivor friend from Germany, was fairly high up in that company in Philadelphia, offered my job an opportunity to have a better life and move to the Midwest. So my father had the courage, of course he had courage, he survived, to take us all and head over to Hammond, Indiana around 1960.
Were there any Jews
50s.
Were there any Jews in Hammond, Indiana when you went there?
Well, we ended up staying in Hammond for just a few months in an apartment. And then we, with the help of the Jewish Federation, my father was able somehow to buy a house. No, we went to an apartment in Calumet City, Illinois, which wasn't that far from where he worked in Hammond. It was across, both towns are really next to each other, but one's in Indiana and one's in Illinois. But in Calumet City, it was a Polish Catholic community and hardly any Jews. The only Jews that I met were in the temple in Hammond. So I think he made a decision not to be around Jewish people. It was hard to talk to him about that, but I learned years later. Part of it's because he felt guilty to be a survivor. Part of it might be that he was angry and couldn't communicate with other Jews. And so we moved to Calumet City. And I went to, not to change my religion, but everybody else was Catholic. So I got to go to churches and all of these other Christian kinds of experiences in
And
Calumet
how
City.
close are you with your brother during this period?
Well, my brother's 4 years younger. We were fairly close. I was struggling quite a bit. I was angry, firstborn. I didn't understand why I was different. I knew I was Jewish. I knew that Jews were considered different, especially in a place like Calumet City, where there weren't any. And I sort of kept that fairly closed. I didn't have a lot of discrimination, but a little bit, mainly because we didn't talk about the fact that we were Jewish.
What language were you speaking? Were you already knowing English, or you were what language at home and what language outside?
So here's another funny story is Leon, he knew Ladino and he knew Greek and some other languages. And my mother knew Yiddish and Polish and some other Eastern European languages, but they couldn't talk to each other. And so the joke is, well, how the heck was I born? Well, people say, well, the language of love is its own language, right?
So how did your parents speak to each other?
Well, my father had to finally learn Yiddish. So he learned Yiddish, and I struggled, of course, when I came to the United States, not knowing any English, and coming in at whatever grade I was in age of 5. So it was really hard. And so I was struggling. My brother, unfortunately, had to deal with me. So he ended up being pretty quiet. And I was the one that pretty much was the guy that made all the noise at the house.
Now, which language did he pick up?
Well, English, because
English
by
was
the time,
at
by
that
the
time,
time he was there, he was just a child.
All right.
So
So
we were raised in Calumet City, Illinois. Yeah.
and what trade did your father? He was left the garment industry in Camden. Did he go into the garment industry in Indiana, or he switched positions?
Absolutely. So again, they found my friend that took him out to Illinois, found a company called Stratajack, which is kind of a famous Jewish company in Hammond, Indiana. They make winter coats, very good winter coats. So he was a spreader, and then he became a cutter in the coat business. And he worked there until he retired.
Wow. Did he have ownership in the business, or?
Oh no, he was he never had an education.
I see.
He was just a worker.
Okay. And your mom was a homemaker the whole time?
Basically, she again struggled a lot because of her experience. She had mental problems that kept her from doing anything except occasionally she would do some sewing to make a little money for people. But basically, she was a homemaker.
So how good of a cook was she?
Mom, I don't want to talk about you, but she would burn the steaks. She knew some things from Poland, but the thing I remember the best is the latkes. She made great latkes.
My
Everything
mom.
else was just basically. I don't think she learned how to cook that much.
So here's a good story for you. My mom was such a fabulous cook and baker, and it was amazing. So when I went to college, I brought my college roommates home for a weekend, and my mom cooked. And one of one of my buddies said, well, how come your pots are not black? And I said, what are you talking about? My pots are not black. He said, well, everything in my house, all our pots are black and everything tastes like burnt. These are like the best meals I've ever had in my life. And what was happening is his mother was burning all the food and all the pots. So it's a funny thing that you mentioned that story. It's
So
immediately popped into my head, you know.
I have a similar story. So one day when I was going to college, I come home and we're going to cook a steak. And I knew what mom's steak was like. So I said, Dad, I know you like a steak, and I will show you how to cook a steak that is delicious. And my mother was so upset that I was taking over the kitchen. Right? So I cooked it medium rare. And it, of course, medium rare is a little juicy in the inside. He loved it.
Mhm.
And from then on, I told my mom, you don't have to cook a steak until it's burnt. It's still safe here. I guess there was fear of,
Yeah, I could hear that.
diseases and that sort of thing.
I could hear that from the hunger that were the food that they had. So tell me a little bit before we go on with how your sister came into the picture and what year was that?
She's 16 years younger than me.
Wow.
So yep. So she was kind of a accident. And so I didn't get to know her very much. I was going to college pretty much as she was growing up.
Mhm.
And
So are you all close now, or even with these age differences, or not so much?
not that much. I wanted to go to California right away after I graduated college. And my father said, don't do that. That's not very smart. He said, go get a job here somewhere and get some experience and have a resume. We don't want you to go to California, but if you're determined to do that, at least have some job experience before you go there. Boy, he's smart. So I did that. And it also turned out that I was at the age where I was going to be drafted to the Vietnam War.
Mhm.
Graduated in 1969, and I didn't want to fight. I was going to be what is that?
Conscientious objector. I would have done this. It's really funny. I would have done the same thing. I was thinking about having to go to Canada during that period of time, and I was very lucky that right before my numbers would go into the hat, they actually stopped the draft. But I was
Wow.
seriously considering going to Canada because I refused to want to fight. Now, that's just me, but that was my thought. And I think that a lot has to do again with my parents came to the United States because they didn't want to put their children under the threat of war all the time. And so I had this thing in my head about war and I just didn't want to fight in the war. Yeah. So let me ask you, before you go and talk about your work, your college, I want to kind of go back a little bit and say what it was like growing up in a survivor's home. And you have siblings. Now, obviously, we'll discount your sister because she's not really in the picture for you. But what was it like growing up in a survivor's home for you, Abe?
It was really difficult, as most of our families had similar experiences growing up with my parents. They wouldn't talk about it. My father was very unemotional, and he just worked. That's what he worked, taught me how to work.
Mhm.
And my
In what
mother,
language were you speaking with your parents?
English,
Okay.
because
Were they talking in other languages when they didn't
were,
want you to know something?
well, they were talking Yiddish, and then whenever they would argue, my father would argue in Ladino. I still probably remember a couple of words in Ladino which meant parts of your body that I won't talk about. But I think that was Ladino that he was saying. And then my mother was yelling at him in Yiddish. Yes.
Mhm. Or were they close and they have a close relationship? together?
No, I don't think so. It was difficult. They argued a lot. And actually, one of the stories is that my sister was pretty upset growing up with them and couldn't wait to leave. And that's one of the reasons why I wanted to go to California. I just wanted to leave.
Okay, so where did you go to, where did you go to college?
I was lucky to get a small scholarship to the University of Illinois in Champaign, Illinois.
My sister went to Champaign, Illinois for a master's degree.
Great, great. So did my sister. I didn't do well in college at all. I ended up going to multiple colleges and graduated from Southern Illinois University in the south of Illinois.
And what was your degree? Did you?
Mathematics.
Okay.
I got a degree in mathematics, and that's how I got my first job. Going back to 1969, 1970, I was lucky enough to get an interview at a company called Allis-Chalmers, which is a lift truck company, material company, and they gave me a draft deferment because they were shipping lift trucks to Vietnam. So people that worked there got a draft deferment. And in terms of my career choice, which is one of the questions you were asking me, was that there was no such thing as a computer science education in college. Remember maybe a digital equipment box or a Unix box or something like that. So when I was interviewed, I told him I got a degree in mathematics, and he liked that because he knew that I would be thinking logically. And he said, that's all you need to do. Just think logically, and we'll teach you the programming language, and you can be a computer programmer. And so that's what I did.
So you were early on to this, into the computer science.
Right. COBOL,
Yep.
RPG, assembly language.
Yep. And so you eventually left, or you were transferred by the company into California?
No, I still had the dream of going. I worked at Allis-Chalmers for 3 years, and then I just decided to fly out to San Francisco and Los Angeles and find a job. And I lucked out in getting a job in San Francisco.
And where did you work?
I worked in a small software. What did they call them? They were writing computer software for a service organization for companies, like payroll software, that sort of thing, COBOL, and other languages. So it was a service bureau kind of a company in downtown San Francisco.
Now, going back to your household, and I follow this whole discipline or theory called intergenerational survivor trauma. I know you have participated in some of the programs that I have put on. Where do you see, you mentioned several times that your mother was suffering deeply from trauma, but how do you feel that trauma has affected you and perhaps your brother and perhaps your sister? So do you know of anything now? Because I'm really setting up a future question. Do you know anything like, from my parents, I have been always been told to excel. An A wasn't good enough if you knew you could get an A plus. And I had to be really good. I had to be good in everything. So how did your parents bring you up? What were the shared values that they were exposed to, which they brought to you and your brother?
So my brother, my sister, and I are 3 points in a triangle. Totally different experiences. Being born first, no direction. They were happy that I decided to go to college. They were traumatized. Matter of fact, one time I got in trouble and was taken into a police station because we were drinking beer before the age with a bunch of guys, and my father didn't discipline me. the other guys lost driver's rights, lost a lot of stuff. And in a way, it was funny that I felt disappointed that my father didn't discipline me. He
Mhm.
said, okay, don't do that again. And it was just the way he was. So I was on my own. So I've done everything basically on my own because of that. My brother then is on the other corner of the triangle, is that maybe because of my outrage, he was quiet. He didn't, he just followed the rules. He just did things the way they were supposed to be done. He
Did you,
followed me. He went to Southern Illinois University like me, became a swimmer like me. And he was totally traumatized when I left for California
hmm.
because
So
he felt
you
I
were his big
deserted
brother.
him.
You
Yeah, I
were his
was,
big brother.
yeah.
And what career does he have?
Computer. He was, well, he ended up getting a degree in mechanical engineering. So he worked in the nuclear industry early on in his
Do,
career.
do either you or your brother have an advanced degree?
Yes, I have a master's degree in computer science, and I think he's got something related to his work in the nuclear industry, but I don't know if he has an official
And
master's
where
degree.
is he located? Here in California or?
No, the rest of my family is in the Chicago area.
Mhm.
I'm the black sheep of the family.
Well, you're the warm one. They're
Warm
freezing.
one.
They're the
And then
freezing. They're freezing in the.
they're freezing. And then the third piece of the triangle is my sister, who's 16 years younger, uh, was probably pressured by them to excel, marry a Jewish man,
Mhm.
and she had to keep it quiet when she was dating non-Jewish boys. And she essentially isn't trying to enjoy life as much as possible.
Now, is she married?
Yeah, she's married. My brother's married. They have, uh, my sister has two kids, and my brother has two boys. My sister has a boy and a girl.
Okay, so I'm going to transfer now to earlier you mentioned to me off screen that you've been married 30 some years. So tell me a little bit about how you met. Now, you didn't meet your wife in school because that would obviously not, that'd be a much longer
Right.
marriage. So you obviously must have met when you went to California. So tell me a little bit about the how-tos of how you met your wife.
My parents never thought that I would meet anybody. Um,
Hmm.
so I was in my 40s. I After I read that book I told you about earlier, the Children of the Holocaust book, I joined a Children of Holocaust organization in San Francisco,
Mhm.
second generation
Yep,
organization.
yep.
And I became really involved in it. I was like vice president. The president was dating, not dating, had a friend that he liked very much. And I met her. Her name was Miriam, and she was part of the group. And one day I asked him, Howard, I can remember his name. I asked Howard, are you dating Miriam? Is it right for me to ask her out? He said, well, we're really not dating. I'm sure he wasn't happy with me asking that. And I did ask her out, and we dated for several years. And Miriam's parents were also Holocaust survivors.
So your Miriam obviously is your wife.
We got married in, I better remember, 19. All right, I'll remember in a little bit because
I'm not going to. I
what?
won't. Oh, she's close by.
1993.
You
She's
got to invite her to come in, and now that we're talking about her, move your chair over and ask her to come in with
Miriam,
us.
come on in. She doesn't want to.
Okay. Oh, I won't pressure you,
She,
Miriam, but you're missing all the
all the
dirt
fun.
that Abe's going to talk about you about. So you met through this 2G group, which is terrific. I met Myra through the Allentown JCC singles group. and
Wow, great.
that's how we met. Um, you know, what's interesting about my story, because my parents never ever spoke to us, I never wanted anything to do with the Holocaust.
Really?
I couldn't read a Holocaust book. I couldn't watch a Holocaust movie. Never watched Schindler's List. Couldn't watch Hogan's Heroes
Wow.
until we came out in 2019 to San Diego, and we didn't know anybody. My wife has been a long time Jewish professional. She was the interim CEO of the Jewish Federation in Minneapolis when she retired in 2019. I made a career of tech startups. I sold my last startup in 2016 when I was 58 and retired. And so we came out and just decided that we needed to get out of we were part of the frozen chosen in Minneapolis. And so we decided that I couldn't handle being, in that temperature of minus 40 degrees in the wintertime. So we picked up and we moved in October of 2019 to San Diego. And we went to, Myra was anxiously interested in getting back into the Jewish community. She wanted to get on the Federation board here in San Diego. She wanted to meet as many Jewish people as possible, as quickly as possible. She can talk to a lamppost. And so we went to an event at the JCC in La Jolla here in California, and it was the first time we were traveling on a California road, and it was disastrous with the traffic. So we left early to get there, and we got there a half hour early, and there was a woman sitting on a bench knitting, and she just started talking to Myra. Myra started talking to her, and all of a sudden, out of the blue, Freddie Packier says, are one of you or both of you a second generation? And Myra looked at me, looked at her, looked at me, and she pointed to me. And I said to because Myra knew that I wanted nothing to do with the Holocaust. And I was I'm traumatized. I can go and tell you my stories, but that's another interview. But we sat down, had dinner together for this event, and we became fast friends. And now Freddie's almost a member of our family. It's it's two sisters from two mothers, and then Freddie invited me and Myra to go to a second gen event, which happened to be that Sunday, coincidentally. And I really didn't want to go. Myra forced me to go. And that's the first entry of me going into the Holocaust world. And I realized when I went there was 50 people in attendance. The San Diego group has about 125 people in it, who are members. And it was the first time that I realized that other people talked and some people didn't talk. And I had shit that I had my whole life, and other people were telling me they had shit their whole life about the trauma and the shtick and all the nonsense that I've been dealing with my whole life. And it opened me up. So I'm sure going into that second generation group did the same thing for you.
I did. And we were there for quite a while. One thing that kept me from continuing to belong there is that it started turning into therapy sessions.
Yes.
People just had no other place to talk about, and just finally saw an area where they could express themselves, and they wanted to start letting out their story and wanting some help. And I said, okay, that's not for me.
Yeah, and actually a similar thing happened here in San Diego. In let's say, I think in 86, they started up, and the same thing happened. The group turned into a therapy group and disbanded because of it. And then it's now thriving as best as it can under social. We do nothing but social. We have a book club, a Yiddish club, a movie club, a bunko, and so it's socially based. And I wish you would have told me that your wife was a 2G, because I would have really kind of put you in a headlock to get her.
I know. Well, I told her late that we were having this, and she figured, well, you've got all of your things written, you know my story, and that you've spoken before. So
okay. No worries. And Miriam, you're forgiven, but not really. So anyway, so you met and you dated for a few years, and when did you get married again?
We got married in 1993
And
in
you're
San
in
Francisco.
Fremont, California.
Well, no, I lived in Menlo Park and she lived
Okay.
in San Francisco. So I
Okay.
stole her from San Francisco, from
And
the city,
what was
took her
Miriam's
into the country.
Miriam's career?
Well, she started off being a school teacher.
Mhm,
She taught after she graduated college, and then she got into nonprofit organizations with Children's Hospital,
mhm.
and then got into the PR world, and then she became a writer for a newspaper, local
Interesting.
newspaper.
So this is a really good time that we're going to actually realize that we just went an hour, you and I talking to each other. So we're going to come back for our second episode with Abe Mizliach in a few minutes. So stay tuned for the Obligations of Memory podcast. I'm Jeffrey Giesener, interviewing Abe Mizliach. See you soon.
Thank you.